All right, welcome to your latest installment of Crops 1 course. I love this cover photograph. I don't know, just love strawberries. Anything about strawberries, man. I can remember being one of those kids when my mom would go strawberry picking. I seem to stuff my mouth a lot more than the basket in front of me. I think I have some sort of base level guilt to this day. Like I'm like I have a criminal record of eating strawberries at a self pick. But anyways, I'm sure I had a big red face as they went through the checkout. My mom hopefully paid for a few extra pints. Anyways, strawberries. Pretty much most of us like strawberries. The purpose of this lesson, I hope none of you are allergic to strawberries, that would be just tragic, but anyways. The purpose of this lesson is to sort of go over the methods of growing strawberries and then finish off with obviously greenhouse approach. Since you're growing strawberries this term and next term, you might as well learn a little bit about it, right? So going back to most traditional methods of growing strawberries, they're what we call field methods, obviously just field agriculture. And it's mounded straw. You can see the straw bedding. This is where the name comes from. I mean, maybe you've already knew that, but I mean, it seems obvious now that I pointed out. Strawberries, like they like straw. There's a lot of reasons for this. Straw creates a nice microclimate underneath. Prevents evaporation so that the plants stay moist. Strawberries like to be on the wet side. It also provides a nice barrier for the fruit. When the fruit ripens and its weight weighs down the branch, the fruit is sitting on straw. So it's not sitting on dirt, it's less likely to develop fungal infections. We've noticed that over the years now that we've been doing hydroponic strawberries at college for 3 years. And we don't grow them long enough to get the mounds big, et cetera, so our fruit sometimes ends up falling on the soil surface and then it rots. So that, and of course then there's weed suppression, right? So the straw mats out the soil and prevents weeds from growing. Modern production practices are what we call plasticulture. You may or may not have heard of this phrase before. This is where plastic is laid down over the mound instead of straw, partly from a cost and labor perspective, and it has a couple other benefits. You can see the fruit laying on the plastic stays nice and clean. It also, the sun warms the plastic, right? So that gets the fruit warm, which can be nice for driving sugars into the fruit to make them sweet. It also acts as a weed barrier. Like I said, it warms the root zone, and that turns into increased productivity in the spring. Whoa, that's a really bad arrow. I'm just gonna stop. Okay. So earlier production, because the root zone warms up. Remember, in the spring when soil's cold, that's when we have issues with nutrient absorption, specifically phosphorus. And strawberries are reasonably phosphorus efficient, but you know, we want to obviously be careful. Straw, of course, also, I forgot to mention, doubles as frost protection for the earlier part of the season. So typically strawberries start to grow under the snow, and in late frosts in the spring, they are frost tolerant. And the straw can kind of be mounded over the plants in the earlier days, and then you just pull it away. But a lot of the plants are bred now to be much more tolerant of a couple of frosts, and it's just fine. So, but of course, this is older production, this is newer production method, plasticulture. This is how the plastic is laid down with a tractor. You can see that cuts down on labor immensely. There's typically a rototiller that tills the soil, and then there's discs that cut it open, and then a roll of plastic that's laid down. And you can see it's kind of anchored at the end so it doesn't pull out as you drive away. And then there's discs that push the soil back in around it to cover the side so it doesn't blow away in the wind. Notice over here we have white, and here we have black. White is not generally used for strawberries, black is. But white has different advantages. There has been some interesting research on using different colored plastics to suppress pests or confuse them, but not with strawberries. A lot of your cauliflower and broccoli kind of farms are growing in these kinds of situations. Again, to cut down on weed, like using of herbicides and stuff like that, which, you know, it's a trade-off, right? On the one hand, you're like, oh, they're using plastic and all the waste, and on the other hand, if they don't, then they're spraying herbicides or burning a lot more diesel to cultivate the rows. So I don't know what to say. You know, it'd be nice if they reuse it, but I doubt very much. I've never seen it reused. You know, it is what it is. So as far as production methods, there are what we call field varieties or short day varieties, are otherwise known, or AKA, June bearing. So that's pretty self-explanatory. They bear primarily in June. And then there's what we call ever-bearing varieties, or also known as day neutral. So I'm going to break these down a little bit. Let's look at this a little more carefully. So in short day varieties, the strawberries initiate flower buds when there's 14 hours of daylight or less. I was going to say, yeah, 14 hours, that's quite a bit, but yeah, or less. So if strawberry buds are produced in temperatures that are cold, as it's saying here, right, then typically we'll say it's a short day variety, but that's not a solid rule. But typically the two go hand in hand, right? So it's kind of an obvious statement, right? When it's cool in the spring, obviously days are inherently shorter. So that's no point really spending too much time breaking it out. These are a list of some of the varieties that are grown. Not going to get into them all. I got a few links. I haven't even checked to see if they all work. Reminder, the links only work on the PowerPoint version, not this video. But June-bearing varieties tend to bear a lot of fruit in a very short time. And that's like a burst of productivity, and then things taper off. And that can work out well if there's sort of a season and you have the capacity to take all that fruit and bring it to market. So what are some advantages, right? So they flower in cooler seasons, which means you're earlier to market. Earliest to market gets the highest price, typically. So, you know, often as winter's ending and people are yearning for spring, if you can bring strawberries on, often people are itching for strawberries at that time of the year. So early to market is critical for getting a good price. Not to mention, when you're growing under cool conditions, we have less pest pressure, which is really great. Remember your growing degree days from Plant Science 1? The idea that if you don't have enough growing degree days, not many insects can emerge. So your pest pressure is greatly reduced, which means from a cost of production, it's greatly reduced because you're not having to spray chemicals all the time or release lots of bios. So those are some advantages to short day. There are ever-bearing varieties and or also day neutral. And I think we need to clarify these two kind of distinguish. Like I'll say ever-bearing are also known as day neutral, but there's some distinguishing features about this. So as opposed to what we were talking about before with standard short day varieties, which produce a pulse of fruit and then taper off as the weather gets warmer. Our other options are essentially, ever-bearing, so they bear fruit constantly, or varieties that are not photosensitive, so day neutral. Remember, short day needs short days. That's why they're called short days. They don't flower very well once the days get long. So here's my list to distinguish, although even then the distinguishing features are minimal. So ever-bearing can fall into two categories: obligate and facultative. right? So if you remember that from Plant Science 1, obligate means they require long days, right? And typically with that comes higher temperatures, so they're okay with that. But they need long days, and that means that the obligate long days are not going to be producing fruit early in the season. So, for example, a field farmer might start with a short day on part of their fields, and in the other fields have long day varieties. So what happens is the short days have a big pulse of productivity, and the long days pick up and carry on. So they maintain consistent supply for a longer period of time. So that requires some logistics and space and land, right? Not everyone has all of that. Facultative long day means that it helps. Long days help, but they're not required. So typically, as day length gets longer, flowering begins to increase, which means fruit yield increases. So those are some key differences between obligate and facultative. Day neutral, right? So there's obligate where it needs long days, facultative where long days help, and then day neutral, obviously they don't care how long the day is. Typically they yield at low temperatures all the way up to warm temperatures, but they have fewer flowers, right? But you still get flowers. So day neutral, depending on which varieties, can offer some interesting advantages from giving the farmer flexibility as far as what yields when. Looking more carefully at day neutral, we have those that are obviously they're insensitive to photoperiod. That's what day neutral means. They flower basically nonstop from 4 degrees up until about 29 degrees. So when you get in the hottest part of the summer, things come to a stop, right? Then they're not yielding much anymore. But they do have a lower temperature threshold, which is good, which means they can start early in the spring, kind of. Maybe not yield a massive push. Their yield kind of builds throughout the summer until you get July, and then things taper off. But they'll still continue to yield right through August and the fall. And obviously right into the winter months until there's a hard frost, and then the fruit, which is frost sensitive, will no longer produce. But there are parts of North America where winter months are not hard frosts. So down in the Carolinas, all the way further south from there. So there's times when they can continue to produce in the fields. So one of the key differences between everbearing and day neutral is their ability to tolerate high temperatures. That's probably the key. So we have everbearing, right? And then we have day neutral. Key differences are the everbearing can produce in excess of 30 degrees Celsius. So if your market is such that you have strong sales well into summer, then you want to look more at the everbearing, where the day neutral kind of max out below 30 degrees Celsius. As far as greenhouse production goes, we have a lot more control, so we have flexibility. Typically, we grow short day varieties alone. There's no point in trying to compete with field production at the peak of their season, which would be long days. We almost always go with everbearing varieties, if not everbearing alone. And so what we're growing at the college is a variety called Albion, which is a everbearing variety. And it is also what's grown at the farms in Ontario that are greenhouse producers. It's a popular variety. It was developed, I believe, by the University of California, and it's licensed there. It's a fairly inexpensive variety. As far as propagation licenses, there are varieties in Holland and Japan, but the Dutch varieties are bred to succeed in the Dutch climate. I remember going to a seminar series at a conference on strawberry production, and the Dutch grower was going on and on about their production methods, and everyone around me was scratching their head saying, but I don't think he realizes that we have a very different climate here, because a lot of what he said made no sense. I felt bad for the guy that he was not aware that our climate is very different. Remember, Holland is overcast and damp and cool. And Ontario is have quite a bit of sunlight hours, and yes, it's cold in the winter, but we have decent sunlight hours, and in the summer it's hot and dry, so it's a much more reproductive climate. Um, so as far as considering varieties, the things that go into making decisions like that are you going to be producing all year, or just the winter, or only in the spring? Uh, a lot of smaller greenhouse producers just have hoop houses and they focus on early spring production. Remember, I said there's a lot of pent up demand for strawberries in the spring. And so some organic farmers will put up a hoop house without any supplemental heat and have strawberries, and sometimes even have strawberries on raised troughs, but they grow kind of as if it's in a field. It's not recirculating hydroponics. And the greenhouse builds up heat from the day and stores it in the soil so that the strawberries actually start producing earlier than they would without having a cold greenhouse on top of them. And that means they're going to markets with fresh strawberries, which brings customers by their table so they can sell other things that they're selling in the spring, like greens, lettuce, spinach, stuff like that. So yeah, obviously demand, price, you got to make money. Availability, is there already a ton of people in the market selling at this time of the year? I already mentioned field production peaks out in June and July. So July kind of dies out, but you know it's tough to grow in the greenhouse because it gets so hot. So they do produce some, but I've got a graph coming up later that shows peak productivity and demand. So, or peak productivity from field production. Oh, there it is. Anyways, you'd think I'd have like a presenter's thing that would let me know what slide's coming up next. Anyways, this is a graph that's got, obviously this is January and this is December. And we're looking at kilograms, volume. So this is North America. This is United States and Canada together. And for the most part, we're looking at around May, June. April, May, June is peak productivity. July is still pretty strong, and then it tapers off heading into September. And the lowest times are November, December, and January. Um, that provides a real opportunity for greenhouse producers at that time. And demand for strawberries has become strong in the winter months. Berries, you'll see, are becoming more and more frequently seen in the produce department year round, as opposed to just when they're in season. Um, there's philosophical problems with that, but the reality is the consumers expect it, and farms are businesses, so they're going to do their best to supply that need. Um, you might be wondering why productivity varies over the different years. Uh, Looks like 2018 had sort of a real good year. Remember, this is field production, so Mother Nature has her say about things working really well and things not working very well. Where 2019 was actually kind of a rough year, a lot of crop challenges, and as we see more and more impact from climate change, a lot of field producers, especially tender fruit field producers, are really looking seriously at greenhouses for protecting their produce, minimizing their risk. So things like hail, hurricane seasons, drought, you name it. These things all have impacts on strawberries. So I have a link in this week's folder, class folder, that takes you to an article that talks about how some of the big field producers are looking at greenhouses now down in the States. If you've bought strawberries at the grocery store, you're probably familiar with the name Driscoll's, which is probably one of the biggest berry producers down mostly in Florida and California. And they are taking a long, serious look at greenhouses as options for them. I know in Ontario we have Mucci is the main big producer. There's also Mastronardi is producing, hot on their heels, expanding as well. So we are supplying a lot of strawberries into the U.S. market, but companies like Driscoll are very big, and if they decide to do something, it's going to happen. So It'll be interesting to see what happens over the next few years. Um, so, are you going to go all year, right? If you're going to produce all year, obviously you're going to go with everbearing. Sometimes you might do a short day neutral in the winter because you get slightly higher yields. Oftentimes those plants have to be cold treated. So the plants are grown, propagated, and then they're put into coolers to vernalize them before they're placed in the greenhouse, and they get a big push of yield. That is a Dutch method. It's a little more complicated, but they produce huge volumes of berries in a short time. So that's something that I think is not being done in Canada. We're keeping it fairly simple right now with mostly just everbearing, the same Albion variety for the most part, or Seascape, and not getting too creative. Now, I think maybe some of the Dutch strategies might be useful when things get more competitive. We'll see how that plays out. So in winter production, if you're only producing the winter, then obviously short day neutral, you get more flowers in cool temperatures, you're going to yield more. But those plants won't be very good heading into warmer weather. So you have to rip them out and replant, which is a cost, labor and plant material, etc. So, but if you're only producing in spring and winter, then typically short day neutral in unheated hoop houses are your best bet. And then that would actually work really well in concert with field production. But generally in greenhouses, it's everbearing varieties that we use. Um, Temperature, okay, so basically, as far as growing strawberries, this is just growing conditions, advice for the grower. Um, Nighttime temperatures are critical. They're probably the most interesting. Daytime, obviously, we talked about that in one of the earlier slides. As long as it's under 29 degrees Celsius, they'll continue to flower. But in cooler temperatures, they flower at a more abundantly. Night temperatures, this is where, and we've mentioned this in the environment class, we need to start thinking like this. Night temperature, especially higher night temperatures, increases respiration, especially in the fruit, which means they're burning sugars, which reduces sweetness. So cool temperatures at night, right around 15 degrees C, is ideal. That keeps sugar levels high in the fruit. And so our DAT, our daily average temperature, is around 14 to 18 degrees Celsius. So your computer is going to monitor that and try to keep it in that average and not let it exceed. By lowering nighttime temperatures to compensate for hot days, etc., just to keep that DAT within the acceptable range. That way you keep your fruit sweet. If you're not monitoring your DATs, then the sugars get burned up and the strawberries don't taste so good. Interestingly, on the flavor side of things, if you go to the grocery store and you go buy clamshells of Driscoll's strawberries, for example, a lot of the times people will complain they don't taste very good. And this is sort of the same thing that's often said about tomatoes and greenhouses. And again, Driscoll's is field produced. So a lot of it comes down to the varieties they choose and how they grow them. One of the things that is done with field produced varieties is that they choose varieties that produce large fruit that take up lots of water because the fruit size impacts the price, which is really unfair. But in agriculture, that almost always seems to be the case, partly because the plant can only produce so many flowers, and if you can make the resulting fruit larger, you can sell water, which is cheap. So you irrigate a little more, you get larger fruit. That fills, fewer fruit fill a container, which means your fixed number of flowers will now fill more containers of fruit than it would otherwise. And you see the same strategy being done with fertigation in blueberries, where you can tell wild grown blueberries are much smaller. And the same number of flowers in a bush will fill a smaller clamshell than hydroponic, or not necessarily hydroponic, but fertigated, that's irrigation water, the fertilizer in it, then fertigated blueberries. They end up being very large. And of course, that fertigation without any increase in sunlight is just adding water to the fruit, which it makes it larger and dilutes the sugar content out, so they don't taste quite as good. But consumers are often so desperate to get their hands on berries at different times of the year that they just tolerate that. Or, you say, well, I'll chop up the strawberries and put a little sugar on them and they taste really good, which is 100% true. But it's not just greenhouses that are accused of flavor issues. It's what I would call modern agricultural practices and strategies. In the greenhouse area, this is actually going in the opposite direction. So, for example, Mochi strawberries, they are held to high Brix levels, which is a method of measuring sugar. They're held to high Brix levels by Loblaws, their Canadian consumer, their main market in Canada. And so they have to be conscious of the sugar levels or their shipment gets rejected. So they have to change their strategies and irrigate maybe slightly less and not push the crop as much so that they get good sugar levels. And obviously monitor their temperatures and climate. DLIs, we talked about that in environment, so now it should make sense when I talk about it. Your minimum daily light integral is 12 moles per square meter per day. If you get into below 12 moles, the plants cannot support as much fruit, so you have to fruit prune. So sometimes that's done in January. If you don't have supplemental grow lights in your greenhouse, then you have to send labor out and they have to pull berries off the plants, maybe cull about half of them so the fruit can actually ripen and be sweet enough. That's basically November to January. Those are your dark months. A lot of greenhouses, what they do is they have supplemental lighting for part of the greenhouse so they can have higher quality, and they try to match the demand for the time of the year, just because grow lights are very expensive, A, to install, and B, to run. The other thing that you can do with plants is you can trick them, right? So you can, depending on the time of day, you can interrupt the photo period with blackout curtains or use photoperiodic lighting, either to extend the day or interrupt the night, all right? So basically, short day varieties, you can mess around with that, and then you can get a few more flowers. But keep in mind, it's fine to mess around with photo period to get flowers to set. But if you don't have the DLI, having more flowers is a liability because the plant can't support more berries. So this is where a lot of research has to be done to better understand what strategies are useful. As far as max DLIs, 25 to 30 moles per square meter per day, that's fairly high. So basically they can handle a fair amount of light. This is what, photo period, this is in the middle of the night where you turn the lights on to break up a long night into 2 short days. So for example, if you're in a shoulder season, say you're growing a short day variety that really likes October, November, December, January, February, March, but you want to have productivity earlier in the season, you can interrupt the night in August and September, and that will make the strawberries think that it's in October or November and start producing more flowers. And it works well in those time of the year because we do have enough DLI in August and September to support the berry growth. You can increase berry production by using photoperiod control. Now remember, you don't need a lot for photoperiod, less than 3 micromoles per square meter. So usually just a fluorescent bulb or incandescent bulb hung over the crops, and you have to have the light on only for maybe half an hour in the middle of the night. And then that breaks that night up into 2 short nights. So the plant thinks that it's a short day, we'll set more buds. Supplemental lighting, this is lettuce here, but turning grow lights on to extend the day is great for your long day varieties, but it's expensive. So you need to know you're going to get a appreciable yield for the electricity you're paying for. Humidity, this is an interesting thing. So in your root zone class, we talked about powdery mildew on the tomatoes and having to keep the plants in that 70% relative humidity range to prevent powdery mildew. Strawberries think about how they're adapted to a spring crop, right? Spring has fairly high humidity. So they typically are adapted to fairly high humidity conditions. One of the challenges we have with our greenhouse is that it's humid, but it also can be dry. And we talked about how dry conditions will sporulate powdery mildew. And once it's sporulated, then when you get that higher humidity, they can actually grow. So oscillating between being dry and then having damp evenings, say rainy weather, powdery mildew can become a real problem. Also, botrytis on the fruit. If you see strawberries rotting, it's most likely botrytis. The other thing that we've noticed in the greenhouse, if you haven't, you should take a look, is tip burn. Tip burn in the young leaves is typically insufficient calcium because remember, calcium doesn't travel to the edges of the leaves very well. You need lots of transpiration. But there is a caveat to this. Unlike a lot of other plants, strawberries are kind of quirky in that if you have too much transpiration, so if it's too dry, which to be honest, it was in our greenhouse in the early September month, what that does is water actually no longer flows to the young leaves, it goes to the old leaves, right? And that means that new tissue doesn't get transpirational flow, which means you end up with tip burn. You may actually have enough calcium in the nutrient solution, but it was just too dry and there's too much transpirational stress on the strawberry. So again, complicated. You have to sort of look at the whole situation. If you're adding calcium to the nutrient solution, then you say, well, I shouldn't have issues unless I don't have enough transpiration. But you also know from some school here that strawberries have the susceptibility to demonstrate calcium deficiency if there's too much transpiration because the young leaves just don't get the water. It goes to the big ones. Confusing, I know. This is what it looks like right now at the college. If you look at the young leaves, you'll see this exact symptom. This is the very ends of the growing leaf where calcium can't get to it. It's too far away. And especially if it's very dry, the water is actually going to older leaves instead of here. It's not going to these leaves. But there's two things going on at the college. I'm going to say, yes, it was dry in September, but the main issue is that for the most part, 2820 is being fed to the strawberries. And I haven't seen 14014 go in there, which means there's not a lot of calcium going in. Another symptom of calcium deficiency is what we call calyx burn. Every strawberry, I'm sure you know, has these sort of leaves around the crown of the fruit. That's called the calyx. That's the petioles from the flower, collectively called the calyx. And the calcium deficiency shows up at the tips of each calyx as a burn. So more evidence if you're looking at calcium to decide if it's calcium or transpirational issues. As far as substrate goes, strawberries, we talked about this briefly in the lab, they really like a well-drained soil. These pictures are from a study that was done by University of Arizona, comparing 50-50 cocoa perlite, 70-30 perlite, and 100% cocoa. And you see a huge difference where there's no perlite. Kind of hard to say which is better here. 50-50, 70-30. The 70-30 looks a little bit better. With the Albion ever-bearing variety, which of course is very common in greenhouses, which is why they chose it. Again, 50-50, 70-30, not too bad. So I think we're not quite at 50-50 at the college. We are closer to the 70-30, I think. But basically what it shows is that it's fairly forgiving. As long as you have a decent amount of perlite in there, you're good. Because the roots need oxygen and they need drainage. So perlite is absolutely critical. The other thing that is interesting is the volume of soil. Higher volumes increase yields. I think our troughs, the pots we got, which were sort of, we had limited options at the time, they're on the smaller side. And if the plants were actually in big gallon pots, probably the plants would become larger and we'd be producing even more fruit. But we're not too concerned about that right now. Although if you look at the one row that's just Rockwell blocks and an aquamat, it's not yielding very well. So that really points to the root mass being a big factor in overall yield. pH. you'll notice I often say, you know, don't get too stressed about pH. It's a pretty broad range. They like the pH down around 6.5. Not as low as true hydroponics, because technically it's not really true hydroponics. We're doing sort of fertigation with recirculation. So there's still some soil, there's still some cation exchange. This would be more like growing poinsettias or pot mums in peat moss, in the sense that pH can be a little bit higher. But typically the fertilizer would have some ammonia in it, so that as the roots are feeding on it, it would gently acidify the media, if you don't want to use acid injection. But if you saw yellowing, you would know it was iron deficiency, and that probably means your pH has just crept up too high. We've talked about this a lot by now, so that should be pretty obvious to you. As far as ECs go, strawberries definitely want a low EC, should not exceed 1.5. That's net, right? So we're around 0.3 city, so subtract that from whatever you read. So if we're around 1.5 to 1.8, or even up to say 2, we're okay. But above 2 EC, not so good. Generally, it's a lower EC requiring crop. It's not a heavy feeder. I mentioned it's fairly efficient in the spring. So you don't, oversupplying nutrients is not going to do much for you in terms of increasing yield at that point. Maybe make the fruit a little larger, but irrigation. Remember we talked about leach fractions with the tomatoes, so same thing. We're looking around 30 to 40%. Again, lots of perlite, so there's good drainage. So almost half, at least a third of the water you put in should come out every time you give irrigation events. And this is very typical, start in the morning, end mid-afternoon, but there's no real surprise there. The number of irrigation events per day, anywhere from 6 to 12. We don't have an intelligence system at the college, we just have a timer, but typically the greenhouse would float the irrigations up as you end up with more solar radiation. If it's an overcast day, you're going to focus on lower shots. So again, kind of common sense. Irrigate more with sunlight. As sunlight increases, irrigate less as sunlight decreases. As far as how much to irrigate, this is kind of, I don't know, we're nowhere near this. 33 mils per shot for a total volume of anywhere 200 to 400 mils per plant. I think we are quite a bit higher than that, and we haven't seen a lot of issues. Again, you got all that perlite in there with high leach. I don't think it's as big of a deal, but if you're not recirculating, if this was field production, then this would make a lot more sense. Pruning. Strawberries do require some maintenance. Removing old leaves, first of all, prevents disease, because the old leaves start to die and they sit in the soil and they start to rot. They also invite insects, which is not great. So removing old leaves is definitely a good practice for just general crop maintenance and hygiene. The other thing is when we have runners, right? Those long strands coming from the plants with baby strawberry plants, unless we're trying to propagate, which I think one trough we're going to let go for that purpose, but for the most part you would remove those, because again, it takes a lot of energy to grow these, and if the energy is going there, the sugar is going there, which means it's not going to fruit. And we want to direct that to the crown where we get new growth. The crown is where all the leaves come together at the root, right? That's that central compressed stem. That's the crown. So typically flower pruning can happen, especially in the darker months of the year. Again, you know, if you start having lots of flowers produced, but you don't have enough sunlight, so you have no supplemental lighting, it's no good to you to have 15 berries developing on a single plant when it has enough sugar to grow maybe only 7. So that takes some time as a grower to know when you need to start removing flowers early on. Don't remove the fruit. Man, you've really wasted sugars if you let fruit develop. You would prune the flowers at that time of the year. Just pick a few off. Have the staff go through and nip a few flowers off. The other thing that can happen is as the days get darker for some, especially ever-bearing varieties that are not necessarily short day but produce year-round, which is what Albion is what we have at the college. If the plants stop producing fruit or flowers, there's less happening. You can actually snap branches off the crown, and that will steer the crop towards being more reproductive. So typically you're looking at around 1 centimeter across the crown is about right. If you get the crown too big, it might start getting vegetative on you, so you break pieces off. Often plants can divide and form multiple crowns, which is fine. Each crown would be treated individually, but they should be around 1 centimeter in size. Another thing to point out that I missed with the flower pruning is that the flower size correlates with fruit size. So it's a lot easier when people are going through pruning flowers to just prick the small ones off and leave the big flowers. And then you know you're going to have decent size fruit as it matures. Pollination is a big factor with strawberries. Now, we don't have bees at the college. Matt's talking about getting some bumblebees. This is a bumblebee box. It saves us a lot of work. Last year we used brushes and we brushed the pollen from the anthers onto the pistils for each flower, and that way we could get strawberries. If we start seeing, and we typically do see strawberries that are misshapen like this, students often think, oh, we have a boron deficiency because the apical meristem is being damaged. Oops, I moved the slide. But the reality is it's actually incomplete pollination. So these bumblebee hives, which we buy, they have their cones inside that they can survive on, and the bees come out, collect pollen, and fly back. And you can open and close the gate to control the movement of bees, depending on the time of day and how much pollination you need done. If you leave the bees out for too long, they actually will start to damage the flowers, and you will also get deformed fruit. So you have to kind of keep an eye on how much the bees are flying around and what, you can stand and watch a section for a while, and if bumblebees are visiting the same flowers over and over and over and over again, you have too many bumblebees out. You need to close the trap. So the way it works on those boxes, there's an in and an out. So when you close the exit, the bees can still get in, but they can't get out anymore. So you can, maybe if you have 2 hives in a section of your greenhouse, you close one, just leave one open, or you close the trap for a few hours, or maybe from noon on. There's no standard for this. You just have to think it through, and I'm sure that greenhouses have protocols in place. As far as pests go, strawberries are frequently attacked by aphids. Green peach, I've seen melon aphids, I've seen woolly aphids. An excellent predator for aphids is the brown lacewing larva. They're nasty looking things, but they're very effective. And when you're looking at the leaves and you see all these white fluffy things, those are the casings. As these molt, they shed their skin, and the skin is left just wherever they were, and you'll see skins from moltings all over the leaves. You may only have, maybe there's only 9 aphids on this leaf, but they've molted enough times that it looks like there's a gazillion. So yeah, aphids they're generally a pain, but lacewing larvae seem to work fairly well. Thrips, biggest headache. Thrips eat the fruit. If you see browning on the fruit like this, sometimes people think it's a rust infection. It's actually thrip damage. And then also you'll see purple streaking in the leaves. I've had students think it was a phosphorus deficiency, but again, it's thrip damage. And we know we have thrips in the greenhouse right now, so that definitely is something we should be looking for in the strawberries. As far as controlling thrips, Aureus insidious, which is great. Amblycius cucumaris, also very good. And then a newer one that's very effective is Amblycius degenerans. We bought some degenerans last year for our peppers, and man, did they just devastate the thrips. But I'm not doing bio stuff. That's up to Graham to decide what he wants to show you guys. I know field producers really like Aureus, and what they do is in their fields, you'll see rows of alyssum, which is a white mounding, little white flowers in a mounding annual. They plant alyssum in the crops, and the flowers of alyssum attract Aureus because they can feed on their pollen. And if you can attract Aureus to your crop, then the Aureus are also going to go into your strawberries and keep any thrips under control. Whoops, I was supposed to erase that. So 3 excellent controls for thrips. That's pretty much it for strawberries. We talked about a lot. We talked about day neutral, short day, long day, obligate, facultative. We talked about DLIs, temperatures, field production versus greenhouse production. We talked about market strategies, when to grow. We talked about managing plants with removing old leaves and pruning crowns, removing flowers to leave the larger ones. A lot of stuff, hopefully interesting. So when we're in the greenhouse, now that we've had this lesson, we can maybe walk through the strawberries and talk about them as well. Okay, have a great Thanksgiving weekend. Bye.